All right. We are live and in person. Well, the first thing I want to do is welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. We've got a brand new webinar tonight. And like I said, Robert Brewer and I are going to be talking to you for about 45 minutes. And our main topic tonight is going to be the science of wildlife or the science of wildlife management. There is a lot more to managing the resources, the wildlife resources, than many people think or understand. And so we thought this would be a really cool topic to teach people because it always helps when people have a better understanding of what needs to be done in order to better protect and conserve our resources. And it dawned on us as we started putting this together. I was putting it together a few days ago, and there is just no way we can teach you about wildlife management in 45 minutes. And so as I got moving through this, I thought, you know what? Let's just tackle this one little topic at a time. So the very first topic we're going to talk about today is going to be about populations and how we estimate animal populations, and it'll be a really fun, exciting discussion about how we figure out how many animals are out there. But it's a small class, so I really want you guys involved, engaged. Ask us a lot of questions. These are the best classes is when we can get intimate with each other and really pick each other's brains to find out what's going on. So with that, let's get started with today's talk. I know all of you know who we are, but some people will register for the class and they've never been introduced to myself or Robert. So we're going to do really quick introductions, just give you a little bit about our background, and then we'll dive right in. So Robert, if you want to introduce yourself and just a little bit of background about what you do.
Okay. Um, I'm really a professor at a community college, Cleveland State Community College in Tennessee. I coordinate all the programs in the Vital Center for Natural Resources and Conservation there at the college. Work with Daryl and SWAP, engage students in as much research as we can get them into, and I'm very active in our state and student chapter of the Wildlife Society.
All right. And most people know me. I'm Daryl Radijak, also a wildlife biologist. I spent most of my career with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. I was in charge of their big game program, so things like deer and elk and bears. That was me. Started my career. Most of you know I started my career with Appalachian Bear Center, which is now the Bear Rescue. So I've got a lot of big game animal experience. But about 3 years ago, I headed west to New Mexico, and now I am living and working every man's dream of working in the Rockies. So, what we're going to do, I would like to start off here because there's one thing that I always uh, find a little bit unnerving whenever I'm dealing with the general public. Oftentimes, they can't discern what is good science and what is bad science. And there definitely is a difference between the two. And so, what I want everyone to understand whenever we're talking about science or wildlife management, this isn't just people's opinions, throwing it out there, and everyone just thinking what they want to think. Science involves a very rigorous method. Now, I'll show you some of the steps in this scientific method, but it's really, really important because literally everything that we do, our societies are founded and built on science. We advance as a human culture because of science, where we learn stuff and we understand stuff, and we're constantly progressing in each and every field. So from math to chemistry to biology to the arts, there's a, maybe not the arts, but there's a strict scientific method that we follow. And so one of the first steps when we're talking about science is that someone will make an observation of something that's going on, and it requires further investigation. So literally there's a question that comes up about why things happen or how things happen. So it's that initial observation that's made that kind of triggers this scientific method.
Hey, Daryl,
The
can I jump in
next,
right there? Can I jump in
absolutely,
right there?
absolutely.
That in some instances is a stopping point for science. You can make an observation, it's been observed, you've recorded it, and you're done with it, but it doesn't answer anything. It's just a simple observation. Audubon was great at that.
Yeah, there's lots of folks that will see something happen and they apply that to everything, and that may not be the case. This is where the second step really is important. This experimentation. So if you have a question about how things happen or why things happen, then you start this process of experimentation and you form a hypothesis. Robert, and I'll let you explain hypothesis more in depth. You deal with this more than I, especially with a lot of students you teach.
Yeah. Okay. So a hypothesis is you make the observation that raises a question. A hypothesis is a tentative answer to that question. So you think you know why something is occurring. So you form a hypothesis. Then the next step is to actually test that hypothesis. So you collect and you analyze data, and it either supports the hypothesis or it doesn't. And so you're drawing a conclusion. Yes. What's that?
Give us an example of what a hypothesis would be and how you could test it.
I use the one I use in class. Everybody's had this happen. You go out one morning, you stick your keys in your car, and you turn the ignition, and nothing happens. Your car doesn't start. So the first thing you do is you ask, why doesn't my car start? Well, instead of just leaving it alone, then you start thinking, well, maybe the battery's dead. That's your hypothesis. To test that, you charge the battery or you change the battery. Well, it either fixes it or it doesn't. That's your collecting and analyzing data and drawing a conclusion. Same way you can say the battery's in a flashlight. If your conclusion or if your data supports the hypothesis, then fine, you're done. If it doesn't, you need to formulate a different hypothesis and test it until you finally know the answer or you have the answer supported that you thought it was. So I'd run down a list of things for why my car didn't start. Maybe it was out of gas, maybe it was a dead battery, maybe the ignition was bad, until I found the problem and solved it. And that's what science attempts to do.
Fantastic. That was an excellent example. I never heard that, but I think that's what I'll use from here on out because I always jumped right into the animal thing, but I think the car thing is a great example. But literally, this is how science works. And here's a final thing. Now, this is not mandatory, but in the science world, it's really, really important. Whoops. Once you do all that investigation, you form that hypothesis, you collect data, you draw a conclusion. One of the things that really makes your findings credible is to get your findings published. And I'm not talking getting it published in the local newspaper. There are things called peer-reviewed publications, and they're dedicated to all the different sciences, whether that it's chemistry or wildlife or just there's so many different scientific journals. And what those consist of is just a collection of all the experimentation, all the studies that have been done. But in order to get published in there, it goes through this peer review process. And literally what that means is if you're a wildlife biologist and you conduct a study and you think you come up with some conclusions that are really important, you submit it to a journal. And what happens is before that gets published, it gets sent out to other very knowledgeable, it gets sent out to other people to edit it, to make sure that what you're proposing, what you did is sound scientific research. And so you can't just write something up, send it to get it published. It literally has to go through this peer review process where they confirm that your findings are accurate. And the one thing I will add here, and it'll come into play, and hopefully we'll mention it later, is part of what you're trying to do is you explain your entire study so that someone else can replicate it. So if someone sees something and says, wow, that's really interesting, they should be able to follow the exact steps that you did, and hopefully, if it's a good study, they'll come up with the same results, the same conclusions. And that's what they're looking for. Now, sometimes things get published that can't be repeated, and so that kind of sends up a signal that maybe that initial study may have been flawed. Maybe we should look at it again. And the reason I'm bringing it up is right now there's a lot of discussion in the deer world about chronic wasting disease. And there's so much data and information about what causes chronic wasting disease. And someone just came up with this alternate theory. And it's great if it if it holds true, but people are having a hard time replicating his results. And so this is why science is a very rigorous process. And this is how we learn, this is how our society advances. Now I will tell you, this is the warning. See if this goes right. Google is loaded with lots of information. There's some really good stuff there, but there's a lot of non-scientific stuff. And just as an example, I typed in cougars in the East, and there's all these websites. And this is an article about living with cougars in the Appalachian Mountains. And so this is something where the general public could look this up and think this is really, really good stuff, but this is not scientifically peer-reviewed publications. So you got to be really, really careful of where you're getting your information. So with that, we're going to dive into today's topic, which is about animal populations. And so when we're talking about the world of wildlife or wildlife management, there's a couple of different avenues that we can go with wildlife studies. Now, there's lots and lots of biologists out there that get into this because they love animals. They want to research individual animals. They might have a favorite species. And so most of their work involves around different aspects of that animal. For example, their behaviors, their physiological responses to things. It literally involves the actual animal itself. Now, there's another field of wildlife that's big and still growing. It's this idea of habitat. And instead of dealing with individual species, they're dealing with protecting habitats, which are obviously homes to lots and lots of species. Now, I will tell you, in our society, most agencies that are responsible for caring for our wildlife resources, whether or not it's a state entity or a federal entity, we're shifting. Early on, mid-1900s, when a lot of these agencies were forming, wildlife management was a relatively new field, and we were just trying to figure things out. And there's many people responsible for advancing this field of wildlife management, Aldo Leopold being one of them. But early on, mid-1900s, a lot of these new agencies are forming, and we didn't know any better. And so we were focused on individual animals. And so if you look at state wildlife agencies, oftentimes they were created, they had one division that dealt with wild turkeys, one division that dealt with deer, one division. They were going species by species. And literally, many of the agencies that I'm familiar with were still operating in that regard up until recently. And you know as well as I, there's literally thousands and thousands of species. There's not just deer and turkey and animals that people see. There's thousands and thousands of species that we don't hardly ever see that are just as important as any other species. And so there's no way you can have an agency that's going to have 2,000 different biologists, each one responsible for an individual species. So if you look at it from a management perspective, over the last decade or two, we've been shifting away from this individual species management, and we're shifting more towards habitat management. Because it's like that Kevin Costner Field of Dreams type of thing, where if you build it, they will come. So if we can protect the habitats and make sure those habitats are healthy and functioning, generally the wildlife takes care of themselves. They don't need humans to take care of them. And so from a management perspective, there's more of a focus on protecting habitats than trying to just focus on individual species. Anything you want to add, Robert?
Yeah, I'll add to that we really, in very few places, do we have any idea of what all is there to begin with. And people tend to think about animals. Notice you put that little tufted titmouse on there, a cute little bird that everybody knows, one of those charismatic animals, and that's what draws people's attention. But there's a lot of species out there that people don't have a clue exist, and we don't know what their role is in the environment. We just know that we need to keep them just in case. So there are very few places on the planet where we've actually looked and looked and looked to see what all was there. One of them is in the Smokies, and they're still discovering new species in the most visited national park in the country. Uh, so protecting habitats is much more efficient than protecting animals, or let's say managing habitats is much more efficient than managing animals.
And as much as I can, I'm always going to bring Aldo Leopold into the discussion because he was brilliant. One of his sayings, and I'm going to butcher it, and Robert, you correct me if I get it wrong, but one of his more famous sayings was the first sign of intelligent thinking is keeping all the parts, or it was close to that. But it literally means that if you want a healthy functioning ecosystem, you got to keep every part. You can't decide that one species doesn't need to be there or another. You need it all in order for it to be healthy and functioning. Okay, so what we are going to do today is we're going to literally just talk about animals in general. I know most of you love animals, especially certain kinds of animals. And so we're going to focus today's discussion on what we do when we're studying these animals. And there's one big thing that we would all love to know. In fact, it's probably the most asked question of wildlife biologists. And it's really good if we know what we got. Now, I'm not talking about all the different species, but if we're talking about an individual species, how many animals are out there? I can't tell you, I don't have enough fingers and toes to tell you how many times people would say, oh, how many deer do we have in this state, or how many deer are in this county, or how many bears are in the Smokies? They're always wanting to know how many animals we have. And to be honest with you, as a wildlife biologist, it's good to know how many animals you have, or a good idea how many animals you have, because then you could better manage for them. For example, if you know that the population is decreasing, obviously that's going to trigger you to do different kinds of management. Same with the population increasing. So it's always really good to know what is going on with your population. So we are going to spend probably about 15-20 minutes talking about population estimates. How do wildlife biologists figure out how many animals are on the landscape?
Let me jump in.
Yep.
And this is the number one question that's asked is how many of some whatever species it is we have. And it doesn't matter what you answer, you are wrong. And the reason you're wrong is because in the 30 seconds since you determined that number, something has changed. And we'll talk about what changes can happen, but it's the hardest question to answer in wildlife management, in my opinion. It's the hardest question to answer.
Absolutely. But I love this question because the many people want you to know exactly how many animals you have. Yeah. And it's an impossible question to answer. And it's funny because sometimes you'll read something and you'll see an estimate of, for example, they estimate the number of grizzlies in the Yellowstone ecosystem to be 718. That could have changed in the last 30 seconds.
And so an error of 300. Who knows?
Yes. And we could talk about that. So moving on, I'm going to talk about some of the animals that I'm most familiar with. You all know that I was the big game coordinator, so I worked with deer and bear and elk. So sometimes it was really, really easy for biologists to know how many animals we had, because let's take white-tailed deer as an example. And most of you, I believe, are on the East Coast, although Kelly is in California. I don't know the history of California, but if you are on the East Coast, you have to understand there was many wildlife populations that were literally completely wiped out, almost completely wiped out. They may have hung on in small pockets in some of the most remote areas, but for the most part, because of this European settlement that swept across the country, we eliminated the habitats. We cut down forests where a lot of these animals lived, and we hunted animals for food. There's this idea of market hunting where there was no regulations. You could shoot as many as you want. And the people did that throughout the 16, 17, 1800s. They were just shooting animals at will. And so many of our wildlife populations, especially the more charismatic, bigger animals, they were literally wiped out from many, many places throughout the country. And so, beginning in the mid 1900s, with this onset of wildlife management and trying to restore our wildlife resources, we did these huge projects where we're trying to bring back animals that I'm going to use a fancy word, that were extirpated. Extirpated simply means locally extinct, where they were wiped out of a specific area. They weren't extinct completely, like gone from the face of the earth, but they were gone from these localized or regional or these regions. And so with a species like white-tailed deer, it was really easy in the beginning. Say we're trying to restore deer in a specific county. We would do these restoration efforts and we would release, say, 40 deer into a county, and we knew 30 of them were females and 10 of them were males. We knew exactly what that population was because there wasn't any others. We restored them. And so sometimes it's really easy to know what you got because you didn't have any and you put some there. Now, what happens? Let's fast forward. And so in the earlier times of deer restoration, where we're restoring deer to the landscape, we know roughly how many deer because we knew exactly what we put in there. But if you fast forward a decade or two, deer reproduce, they have babies, they die, lots of things happen. And so over time, it becomes more and more difficult to know how many animals or how many deer you have. And so what we do is we use this thing called population models. And what that population model is meant to do is it's to help you figure out how many deer you have based on a number of different variables. And so these things, I'm putting this up to scare you because they can get really, really complex. And so the main thing I want you to understand here is, again, wildlife biologists, it's quite an intensive course load, and it's a degree, and it's a legitimate thing because there's a lot of people out there that think they go on a hike, they're automatically a wildlife biologist. And there's a lot more to wildlife biology than just being able to recognize different animals. But we're not going to talk about this. We're not going to talk about this really complex thing now. Robert, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, before you jump away from that, understand that when we say a model and he has a drawing there, in reality, this is a mathematical equation that we would develop with variables. So every time I have a student ask me, why do I need algebra? I laugh because I know they're going to need a lot of algebra. But it is an algebraic equation with variables that you decide what the variables are, and you're putting in certain variables, and that matters. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's perfect because it leads in, and this is great because Robert's kind of flying blind with a lot of this here tonight too, and he's leading into exactly the way that I was going to go. And so with these population models, like you said, they're mathematical equations where you're trying to figure out how many animals you have. Now there's these variables, n here, and I promise you this is the only math I'm going to show you today. But N literally stands for number of individuals. So how many animals or individuals you have in a population. That's what N is. So it stands for population. Sometimes people use P, believe it or not. But you're trying to figure out this mathematical equation that will calculate how many you have. And here are some of the things that you need to know. It is really important when you're trying to figure out how many animals are in a population. A big thing that you really ought to know is how many are getting born each year. What is the birth rate? Now, there's a fancy word that biologists use that will be thrown out. If you've never heard of it, that's okay. But sometimes if you hear people refer to natality, that is the birth rate. How many animals are being born into a population? Really important to know. Really important to know that if you're trying to calculate how many animals you have. Now, here's where it begins to get complicated because it'd be great to say, all right, a population, every female will give birth to one offspring, but it doesn't always work like this. And this is where some science comes in. And I apologize that got cut off, but sometimes you have to go and look at individual age classes to see differences in the birth rate. For example, I'll use bears. First off, if you're looking at different age, you could have a female bear. Not every female bear is given birth. 1-year-old bear or 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old female bears generally don't give birth. They're usually not given birth until they're usually 4 years old. They could do it a little younger, but you have to know when they start giving birth. Here's another example, like with white-tailed deer. A white-tailed deer will give birth, a female white-tailed deer will give birth when she's 1.5 years old. But usually when she gives birth, if she gives birth, it's only going to be to one fawn. But any of the older deer, whether or not they're 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, they generally give birth to 2 fawns. And so you have to kind of know what the birth rate is per age class to help construct a better equation or a better model. Anything you want to add?
No, we'll get into it a little bit later, I think. But yeah, what you're saying is very, very important. And this only works. The birth rate will only help you if you know how many animals you have on the land to begin with.
Right.
And if you know what sex the animals are, if you know your sex ratio, and then if you know the age of those sexes. So
there's a lot.
It's very, yeah, it's very, very hard.
Yes.
To build a model that's accurate.
Absolutely. And I got some anecdotes. Okay, so it'd be good if you knew how many animals were coming into your population that are being born into your population. Equally important is how many animals are dying in your population. And so the death rate, it's pretty much the opposite of birth rate. But once again, there's these differences per age class. Now, if you look, I'm sure most of you can guess, and you don't probably like thinking about this, but the most dangerous age of any animal is usually their very first year. Mortality or the death rate is really, really high for young animals. It's hard to survive. And so sometimes it all depends on what species you're talking about, but sometimes only 50% of the young of that year survive. If you look at rabbits or some of these other animals that give birth to lots and lots of babies, sea turtles, lots of things like that, the odds of the offspring surviving are really, really small. Robert, do you think we should go into K-selected and R-selected or no?
I don't think so this time. Okay, it really gets, but again, their populations are selected or K-selected. And there are certain types of species with certain birth rates and death rates that fit those.
Yes.
And I don't know why I have the sneezes so bad.
You sound like me. I'm usually coughing or sneezing, but I'm actually clear today. But what Robert and I are talking about with this R-selected and K-selected, there are some species that will give birth, like for example, rabbits. They give birth to lots and lots of babies in hopes that 1 or 2 survive. And so the percentage that survive when they're really young is really, really small. But then you have other animals, for example, humans, bears, great apes. They'll give birth to very few offspring because they provide so much more maternal care. And so the odds of that offspring surviving are much, much higher, but they only give birth to fewer animals. So not to get too complicated, but this is going to show you how complicated you can get in this world of wildlife biology and estimating populations. All right, I'll run through these next 2 really quick, but there's these 2 things called emigration and immigration. Now, the animal may not be born, may not die, but it may leave a population. It can migrate. It could leave from one area to another area. So that's all emigration and immigration is. And so that would be good to know. And so you're starting to see there's a lot of these different things that you need to know about the species that you're dealing with in order to come up with this population model. Now, Robert mentioned it. I will mention it again because I've had lots of experience with this. You can get extremely complex with your population model. And I would caution people, my fellow biologists, not to get too complex. Because if you have to figure out or make guesses or collect data, and you have to put in variables such as what percent of one year old animals survive, what percent die, and you're doing it for every age class, it's getting really, really complex. And I will tell you, in a lot of situations, you have to provide your best guess because we simply don't have enough data to say for certain. But based on things we know, we'll guess. We'll put in the best guess. Now, the more and more variables that you build into it, it drives me nuts because it becomes way too complex, and I think it breaks down those models. And I'll give you an example. Robert, I don't know if I told you this, but I was asked to model the population of deer in the state of Tennessee. And the model that we were using, or this formula we were using, it had variables, like 5 or 6 different variables for every age class, male, female, and there was just so much that you had to guess at to put in. And so I'm going to put this up there. Beware if you're guessing at stuff and you're putting garbage into the model, odds are you're going to get garbage out of the model. And we used to talk about this all the time as wildlife biologists, to say garbage in is garbage out. So the moral of the story is, if you're trying to figure out how many animals and you're using a population model, try to keep it as simple as possible. Usually those will have the best outcomes.
And I'll add too, in many instances, and this will lead into what we're going to talk about, we don't need a number. We don't need an exact number, especially if we're dealing with that habitat and we're dealing with multiple populations, keeping in mind that a population is a group of animals that have the potential to interact. And we know we have more than zero. We know they're there. We don't necessarily need a number. We can do without that.
It is amazing how you are reading my mind and planning ahead, because the next thing we're going to talk about is a population index or population indices. And this is kind of what Robert was leading to. This is not going to give you a number. And the greatest example I have, many of you have seen this picture. This is a picture of me working on a bear bait station. And what that was a population index. Because I wasn't measuring how many bears are out there. I was measuring something that's going to tell us if the bear population is going up, it's going down, or it appears stable. We have no idea what the number was. And this is exactly what Robert was mentioning. You don't need to know the number, but you need to know that the population's doing okay. And there's all sorts of different indices that you could use to determine this. And so what an indice is you're going to measure something over time. You're going to collect data over years and years and years to see what the population is doing. And oftentimes you measure something that simply represents the population. And so in that bear bait station example, we were looking at how many bears were visiting, or how many bait sites were getting visited each year. So when we first started that study, and I'm drawing from experience in Tennessee, we started collecting data early on, and about 10% of our bait sites were getting hit by bears. 10 years later, it grew to 30%. 20 years later, it was 50%. Towards the end, we were having about 70-80% of all of our bait sites being visited by bears. Did it tell us how many bears there were? Not a clue. It could have been 10, it could have been 1,000. But we know over time that population was increasing because the number of sites being visited was increasing. And so that's what we mean by a population index. Another example, and forgive me for referring to animals that I'm very familiar with, you can literally pick up, you can find out information on the internet to literally find what an animal population is doing. For example, with white-tailed deer, oftentimes you can look at like insurance claims, and you can look over time to see how many deer were for example getting struck by vehicles in 1980 versus 1990 versus 2000 2010, and that's an index of that deer population. If we're getting more and more deer hit on the road, there's a really good chance there's more and more deer out there. Now you have to understand all the variables in there, because it could also be affected by there's more cars on the road. So understanding all the things you're looking at in this index is really, really important to making an educated guess whether or not your population is doing good. I'll give you another. Go ahead.
Oftentimes, the reason we do the index is one, it's easier to collect the data. Two, it's much cheaper. I mean, in theory, if we had unlimited funds, unlimited time, and unlimited manpower, we could simply go out and count every animal. But we don't have those unlimited things. So we're looking for ways that we can get some good information within our budget, within our manpower, within our time. And the indexes work great. You're talking about deer car collisions. Insurance companies have been keeping those records for years and years and years. It doesn't cost us a penny to get that information. And then DMVs have keep the information, how many vehicles we have, how many miles of road we have. We can factor all those in, and we never have to lay hands on a deer or go to the field, and we can get a good index.
Yes. Now I'm still going to stick with deer because, for example, here's another thing, and it's going to lead into our final example of the way we could estimate animals. But here's another index. Everyone knows what those are. Those are raisinets, right?
Yes. Tasty.
Just so you know, one of the best things to do when you're a wildlife professor or teaching students, if you're out, you carry a bunch of raisinets in your pocket, and whenever you encounter a pile of deer scat, you lean down, pretend you pick one up, and then you pop one of those raisinets in your mouth, and you cause half of your class to faint. So one of the things that you could use deer poop with is as an index, because you could, over time, if you're seeing more and more deer poop on the landscape or on your farm or whatever, there's a really good chance that there's more deer if you're seeing more poop. So that can serve as an index. But there's so many unique ways that you can figure out more information about your population. And we can do scat surveys where we do transects. And believe it or not, when you know a lot about the animal that you're concerned about, for example, with this type of survey, you know approximately how often a deer is pooping and how quickly that poop decays. You can literally begin to guess how many animals you have in a population. So, Robert, you want to explain that a little bit more? You've done these before. I haven't done any of these.
These work really well in colder climates because in our southern climates, they decay fairly rapidly, so it doesn't do very well. But in colder climates where the pellets are going to last for a few weeks at a time, we can literally go out and we walk a straight line, a transect, and we survey either side of that line a certain number of feet. When I've done them, I do 5 feet either side of the line, gives me a good 10-foot wide line. Then if I know how far I've walked, I have an area that I've walked. I know the physical area, length times width, that I've walked and covered. And every group of deer pellets that you see, you destroy. Then you go back some period of time later, and you cover the exact same area, and you count the number of pellets that are there. Now, we know that white-tailed deer, for example, defecate about 12.5 times on average per day. And knowing the defecation rate, the amount of area I've covered, and how many days it was since I destroyed every pellet group in that area, we can get an estimate of the population density in that area. That make it clear?
Yes. Does anyone have any questions about that? About indices or population models? I forgot to ask if anyone had questions about the models. I don't have any questions so far with anything we covered. All right. Moving on. And once again, Robert was reading my mind because we're leading to one of the final topics for tonight. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on this. It's this idea of literally counting the population. And there's different ways to do it. There's complete counts where you think you count every individual, or you take a subsample and count animals or things deposited by those animals to figure out how. Yep.
Sandy has a question.
Oh.
It'd be a good time to address it. It says, would you ever determine that there are too many animals in a sector? And the question is yes, or the answer is yes. And it's not always, I'll give you an idea of something else that we use with deer. And it's something called a browse survey. They used just early on when I started working with deer and looking at how much food was left on the landscape, essentially, or how much was available and how much was left. And where I did my work at Bluegrass Army Depot in Kentucky, they had way too many deer, 3 to 4 times as many deer as they should have on the landscape. So yeah, that was the determination. There are way too many deer here, and it's doing damage to the habitat, and the deer were all poor. So yes, absolutely.
I'm glad you brought up that example, Robert, because there seems to be quite a bit of chatter on the news, social media, just regular media outlets about like predator reintroduction, and there's lots of people that are biased against predators, and they're talking about having too many, for example, too many wolves in the Yellowstone ecosystem, or the wolves are expanding and there's too many predators on the landscape. And I have to remind people that it is probably more damaging to have too many herbivores on the landscape. If you look at that Yellowstone ecosystem, it was crazy out of whack back in the 70s and 80s because they exterminated pretty much every apex predator. And so bison herds, elk herds, all these large mammals that eat lots and lots of grass and other vegetation just exploded in numbers. And it literally destroyed many of those areas. If you've ever been to Yellowstone, Lamar Valley, Hayden Valley, it looked to the untrained eye beautiful because it looked like a golf course. The grass was real low. It looked really manicured, and that is awful to the trained eye. I almost hate having a good understanding of what things should look like out there, because lots of people I'll go out with and they're like, oh my gosh, isn't this forest beautiful? And in my eye, I could see things that are wrong with it, whether or not it's overbrowsed or in some situations there's too many trees. And so understand that when it comes to animal populations, herbivores can probably do more damage to an ecosystem than any other animal because they eat the foundation. The foundation of ecosystems is generally those grasses, the vegetation that's out there that supports all other life. And so very, very good question, Sandy. And yes, I agree with you, Kelly. I gotta get my cursor. Oh, I just want to go back and make sure. Okay, yeah, Kelly, I argue that every day too. There seems to be a bias against certain animals, and I think that bias comes just from a lack of understanding on how ecosystems work. And Bet, that's another good example. Robert, have you heard of the issue right now with Isle Royale?
No, I haven't kept up with it.
It's a very interesting topic.
Example of Isle Royale.
Well, the National Park Service is trying to restore and to bring in wolves on that island because the moose are like they're way way above carrying capacity, and they're wanting to restore wolves to help maintain that moose population. Being a national park, obviously they don't allow hunting in there, and so it's just a mess with people drawing the line between this animal's good, this animal's bad. I wish we had stopped this individual species talk and think about ecosystem talk. Okay, so what kind of population counts are out there? And I put this picture up there because Believe it or not, this is one way to count animals. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service uses this all the time when they're counting waterfowl. They will fly over areas and take video and take pictures of these large flocks. And guess what? They would have people going through counting how many birds are captured in that image. So you can do a straight count where you literally photograph or record an area and you literally count every animal in there to get a count. That's probably the simplest, easiest, most direct population count there is. But others are not as straightforward, and we'll talk about a couple of different examples. Okay.
I was giving extra credit if that guy identified all the species in that picture. Sorry, Laurie, no Canada geese.
Oh, I want to see
4 species in the picture.
What is? Hold on, let me get my drawing tool out here. I was looking at this and I couldn't figure out what this was. What is that bird right there?
I don't see anything. Oh, that's a bald eagle.
Is that a bald eagle? Wow. I bet you that bald eagle is licking his chops. He's got a smorgasbord.
Yeah, you've got pintails, mallards, redheads, and a bald eagle in there.
Yeah. Okay. Here, that's the pintail, correct?
That's a pintail. Yes, it's a male.
Okay. Now here, what to the far left side? Oh, that's a mallard.
That is a mallard. Uh-huh.
Hey, Robert, you could. I think you could take control of the marker if you want to call out any others.
Yeah, I can. Let's see here. So, and right there is a redhead, and there's a couple of redheads over here.
Anyway, it's now, pretty awesome.
The reason I brought that up is when you're doing duck counts like this, we fly over or drive by and take a picture, what have you. You have to identify them by species. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes, mallard is a kind of duck, Laurie. The drake is the male and the hen is the female in all the ducks, but a mallard is a species, and a pintail is a species, and a redhead is a species. So we learned to identify these by silhouette, and if you look at the pintails, you can see the pintail sticking out the back of them. Right here. Oops, wrong button. You can see the pintail sticking out of their back. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, I have no shame in admitting to everybody I am a mammal biologist. I've spent most of my career dealing with mammals. I have the utmost respect for birders, ornithologists, that can identify these birds. I was never so impressed. I remember when I was in college, and this is many, many, many years ago, we went to Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge in New York, and my instructor there was teaching us about waterfowl. And he saw these birds on the horizon that were literally just a speck on the horizon. You just saw dots. And he said, "Oh, here comes a flock of widgeon. Widgeon is a type of duck." And I thought to myself, there is no way he knows that. And sure enough, they flew all the way in, and they were widgeon. And literally, these birders, what Robert said, recognizing them not just by the silhouette, but the formation that they fly in, or literally how high or how low in the sky they're flying. It's amazing how much you can learn when you begin studying these animals in detail. And there's something so rewarding. Once you learn this and you're out in the field, it doesn't matter if it's birds or trees or frogs or flowers. When you're out in the field and you know what's going on around you, it's extremely rewarding and powerful, and being able to see and recognize these things is pretty darn awesome.
When you get good at it, you can do it pretty quick.
Yes. Okay, So what I want to do is I want you guys to ask questions throughout this whole time. But literally what I plan on doing for the next little bit is I want to talk about some of the critters we count and whether or not, put it this way, whether or not we have an idea what the population is or how we figure out their population. And we're going to go species by species and tell you different ways that Robert and I have worked with these animals and different methods we use to estimate their population. So, we are going to start with some well-known animals, and we'll get into some lesser-known animals. So, white-tailed deer. I did this. I was a deer coordinator for the state of Tennessee for a long, long time. And one of the ways that we used to estimate white-tailed deer with no S, is using one of the first things I taught you tonight, those population models. Now, when I first started working there, deer were still being restored or were recently restored to many areas, and so we knew we had a good idea how many deer were there to begin with that we put there, and then we were able to model or follow that population over the next decade or 2 decades. But after that, those models really started breaking down. And a good example, I don't think I finished this story, but I was asked to figure out how many deer were in the state of Tennessee, and they gave me this model that they used historically, and it had all these different variables for each age class, male, female, death rate, birth rate. It was crazy complex, and I tried my best to figure out how many deer were in Tennessee. And I put in the numbers that I thought, and when I ran that model, I estimated that we had like 6.2 billion deer in Tennessee. And the chief at the time, Larry Markham, you know Larry Markham, he said, "Well, why don't you increase mortality here or decrease?" And it just got me thinking this is really really bad because it wasn't a good setup because you literally dialed it into whatever number you wanted. And I thought that was a terrible way to estimate deer populations. And so during my tenure as a deer coordinator, we started doing more direct counts. We were using this thing called thermal imaging to help us count deer as we drove down roads. And we were able to calculate, based on the number of deer we saw, how many deer were in Tennessee. And it was much more, I say it was much more accurate, it is much more justifiable because we actually counted deer and we used this thing called distance sampling to help us modify our number. But again, that's really, really complicated. You could spend 3 days talking about that method. But that was one method we used for deer. Robert, why don't you talk about deer for a second? Because I want to show a little video real quick. But if you have any experience with deer, let them know.
Well, like I said, we talked about the pellet counts as an index. Long before we had thermal imaging, I used to have to count deer using spotlights. So we'd drive around at night with spotlights, and you hope the deer looked at you. And when it did, you could count the eye shine. And if you were close enough, you might be able to see if it was a buck or a doe. So that was one way we did it. But more often than not, the deer populations are indexed simply by how many are harvested during the hunting season. And if the harvest is continuing to go up, you make the assumption that the deer population is going up. And if the harvest goes down, you make the assumption that the deer population is going down. They're really an extremely hard animal to get a count on. It's just hard. And you're never going to have even sampling. You just don't have access to them, even with the thermal imaging. So, very, very hard to count animal, even though they're very visible.
Actually, I'm gonna ask you to explain a different method that it won't count how many deer are there, but it will let us know whether or not they're within their carrying capacity. That's the
Yeah.
abomasum.
Yeah,
Go for it.
we every August we do something called an abomasal parasite count. Now, a deer has four stomachs: a rumen, a reticulum, an omasum, and an abomasum. So we collect the abomasum and we count the number of parasites in the abomasum. And we know from a lot of past research that as a deer approaches and exceeds carrying capacity, the number of parasites in the stomach increases above a certain number or a certain density. And if they're below carrying capacity, it's below a certain density. So we'll collect these stomachs and then we'll analyze it. We actually send them to Georgia, I guess, for analysis now. Ben Layton doesn't do it anymore. They count the parasites in. They come back and tell us the deer are below, at, or above carrying capacity. And they can sometimes tell us if they're way above carrying capacity and allow us to make decisions from that. But it still doesn't tell us how many deer we have.
Yeah, and literally what we mean when we're talking about carrying capacity, when we say it's above carrying capacity, simple way to say there's too many deer, there's more deer than the habitat can support. And so they would literally be eating themselves out of house and home. So when it comes back that you're over carrying capacity, our goal is to try to reduce that number so they're not destroying the habitat for all these other animals. Okay, I mentioned thermal imaging studies. I'm only going to show this because it was so cool. I did this for about 6 years. We developed some population estimates of it. But a thermal imaging camera, instead of a spotlight, thermal imaging camera detects heat. And so if you ever watch that show Cops and you see the glowing white guy running down, when I say white guy, it's the heat coming off from that person. Now, I used to use that camera for my deer surveys, and this is what we would see on our deer surveys, and it was pretty darn fun. So, hold on.
Last year in 2006, the agency purchased some thermal imaging equipment to be used.
So you saw how those deer were glowing.
Exciting new territory.
The reason we use the thermal imaging cameras is once it cools down at night, the trees cool off, the rocks cool off, the ground cools off, all the vegetation cools off. The only thing that maintains heat are warm-blooded animals. And so if you go out on a cool night where it's 40, 50 degrees out in Tennessee, and the animals out there are 90-some degrees, that camera detects those differences, and you can see the animals, they glow bright white. It's really, really cool. And that type of equipment really helped us get better counts when we were doing it. But like Robert said, there's no way to get a super accurate count because of all these differences in vegetation and the rate you see it. That's why we're applying all these other statistics called distance sampling that would get us a more accurate count based on how well we could detect them. That's getting way too complicated. So let's move on to the next animal. Okay, we're going to stick with the deer family. Many of you know this animal. It's an elk. We now have some elk, not in the east, not as many as we do in the west. So I'll just mention how we typically count elk in the west. And Trish, I think you might have a good question about this. But what most western states do when they're counting their elk is they'll do aerial surveys. They'll fly either in a fixed wing aircraft or in a helicopter. And they count these animals, these large-bodied animals in the wintertime when there's snow on the ground. They know where these deer or where these elk typically go for their winter range. And when you fly over them, they're really easy to see as they contrast against the white snow. But they also group up in the wintertime. And so many of these animals, especially the larger, more visible animals like elk or bighorn or any of these large ungulates or members of the deer family, they will literally fly these routes and just do actual counts. Now, obviously, they can't fly the entire state, but they'll get an idea how many animals are in an area, and they may extrapolate and come up with a more accurate number. So, anyway.
Same transect method.
Yes. All right. Now let's get to animals that some of you absolutely love. How about bears? What do you think we did with bears? Well, I've already told you one method that we used to use, which was it was a population index. It was that bear bait station survey, which was extremely valuable information really cheap, and it was really good at telling you whether or not the bear population was going up, going down, or pretty much staying the same. However, there comes a point when you are so saturated with bears, there's bears everywhere, that it's not telling you anything new. You could, like right now in many parts of the country where there's lots of bears, you put out the bait stations and most of your bait stations are going to get hit. So it's not informing you anything about that population. So they started doing this new method using DNA analysis. And Robert, you've participated. I'll let you chime in if you want to explain that a little bit.
Well, what we do is we go out, we find an area, and we'll stretch 2 strands of barbed wire between trees, around trees, creating an area in the middle that we want the bear to get into. They'll have to cross the barbed wire to get there, and as they cross the barbed wire, they'll leave hair behind, and we coax them in with a little cherry syrup and some donuts. So we get in there, and they get in there, they leave their hair behind, they leave. We come back and collect the hair, we rebait it. We run this for several weeks. Not only does that tell us, we can tell individual bears that visited the site, and that will give us a much better count of exactly how many bears are in the area, because we don't know at a bait station, when you did with the sardine cans, how many bears visited that site, because the first bear that got there tore the sardine cans down. But with this, we know every bear that visited the site, and we actually have DNA for each one of them. And as we run this from year to year to year, we can get a lot of data from that. If we get the same individual bear for 10 years, we know that bear's at least 10 years old. And we know that they're staying in the same area. We can get a lot more information from it.
Great. Thanks, Robert.
Trish asked, do we only count in certain seasons? And the answer to that is there are good seasons for certain species, so we count them then when it's easier to do. So yes, what we're counting is seasonally dependent. And we actually have a set of best management practices we follow on that. So at this time of the year, we'll count this species, and 2 months later, we'll count that species, two months later, that species, and it makes it much easier and more consistent. I got to say that too. With all indexes, consistency is key. And this killed me a few years back in Tennessee. They changed the way they did their population indexes with white-tailed deer, because we went from mandatory checking stations to online check-in, and then they only had checking stations open for 2 weekends a year. So we lost all that consistency. And so it's going to take years to build back up where I will have any faith in our model again, because we've got to get that data back.
Yeah, and Robert brings up and I want to kind of explain that a little more. What we're referring to is the power of the data really exists in the trend information. So to look from 1 year to the next, and if you've got 10 years of data, if that data is collected the exact same way every year, it's really, really powerful, strong, good data. But if you're looking at that data and they change the way they do things, it puts hiccups. It really messes up your data. And so trend data is extremely important. And I will give you an example. Whenever you're collecting data, especially if you're collecting data from the public, you will get some garbage. There will be people that intentionally mess it up or mess it up on accident. And what I try to explain to people, that's okay. If you're looking at lots and lots of data, we know that there's going to be a little junk in it. But understand that each and every year, there's pretty much the same amount of junk in it. That makes the rest of the data really, really good. So you can still look at that data knowing that there's some bad data in there, but because you had that long-term trend information, it's extremely valuable, extremely informative to tell you what's going on with the population. So I want to get back to Trish's question again regarding weather. And Robert answered it perfectly with the seasonal. There are some some animals you do certain seasons when it's optimum to survey that populations. But another thing with weather, and I'll give you an example from my deer surveys. Sometimes like individual weather events or days can affect your survey. And so like stormy days, when we were doing the deer surveys, we found that if it was going to be really, really, really windy out, the deer didn't like moving much. And so we wouldn't see hardly anything. And so we had these windows, these sideboards that we used that would tell us when the best times to survey were. And some of those windows are seasonally to say, all right, if you are surveying birds, it's the best time to do it when they're in their mating season, in the springtime when they're calling. You could hear them better. You can identify them better. They're much more active. So we'll survey birds in the springtime. Another animal, like I said, we were doing the elk surveys. We would do it. They fly it in the winter time where the animals are much more visible. And so you have sideboards of when you do these surveys. And even within those sideboards, sometimes weather will say today's a good day or today's not a good day. So, okay, so bears nowadays, we used to do the bait station. Now we're doing a lot more of the DNA stuff. And I will tell you, black bears are now, we're using DNA. Grizzlies, literally the DNA surveys that we're using where we're pulling the hairs and looking at it, it literally evolved based on grizzly bear research because it was so important when they were tracking grizzlies in that greater Yellowstone area. They really wanted to get as good a number as they possibly could because grizzlies were the interior grizzlies. That Yellowstone population was classified as an endangered species. And so they wanted to get a really good count. And that's where a lot of this bear DNA research evolved from. And now it's applicable over all North America with black bear species as well. So grizzlies are pretty much estimated the same way. Okay. Trish asked, do y'all use a predetermined number of days or hours to count?
Good question.
Yeah. Really good question. You want to answer it?
I will. Yes, there's actually a statistically viable method called catch per unit effort. So we can use a preset or an allotted amount of time, and then we look for that time period and we stop. Doesn't matter how many we found or whatever, we stop at that time period. And so we can use that catch, the how many we caught, how many we saw, whatever they might be, per unit effort, the amount of time, man hours, man days, whatever those might be. And that gives us our base. And then we can build the index from that. When we do what are called visual encounter surveys, which is a fancy name of saying we walk through the woods looking for them, whatever they might be, we record the amount of time that we do that per person, so we have a total number of hours search was done, and that gives us that catch per unit effort. So yes, and that is statistically valid method of assessing wildlife populations.
That was such a good question because if you think about it, you could go out one year and count a number of birds or whatever you're surveying, and you could get a count. If you go out the next year and like double or triple the amount of time you spend out there, you might end up with the same count. But it's not comparable because one year you only spent 1 day looking for it. The following year you spent 3 days. And so you've really got to standardize your information. And that's exactly what Robert said, that catch per unit effort. You got to know how much effort was put in each and every survey so that data is comparable. All right. All right, Robert, you're more familiar with these critters because you live at one of the coolest places to find them. So how do we count sandhill cranes?
Okay. They actually fly weekly. They fly an airplane over the roosting sites and they physically count them. For Rob Klippel, that is his job. He has to get in an airplane once a week, fly over and count red heads for a physical count of sandhill and whooping cranes for the eastern population. And so they get a very accurate count. These birds don't hide. They're not in the trees. They're not underwater. They're out in the wide open. They're very easy to count.
And that's how a lot of waterfowl are counted. Fish and Wildlife Service do these aerial flights, and they get over these areas that the waterfowl is concentrated, and they may take pictures, they may take video, but they literally count one by one to get the best number possible. All right, how about a bird? Say we're looking at a cedar waxwing, and we want to know how many cedar waxwings are out on the landscape. And we've mentioned this a couple of times. Robert brought it up. Sometimes, guess what? We just don't know. There's really no need to know how many of these animals are out there, but we do still want to keep an eye on that and this is where indexes come into play all the time, because we want to make sure that a species like the cedar waxwing isn't decreasing, I guess it's okay if they're increasing. We want to make sure that they're not bottoming out. And so one of the things that happens, especially with migratory birds, we use a lot of citizen science. And I think Lori asked a question on the Facebook page about citizen science. And what we mean by citizen science is oftentimes we can use the public to help us gather data. Now, it all depends on the type of data we're trying to acquire. And if it's really technical data, we may not ask the public to collect it. We'll let the professionals collect it. But then there's some general data, like observation data of birds. There's a lot of awesome birders out there that really know their birds. And they do what's called, is it the Audubon Society that does the Christmas bird count?
No, it's Cornell Labs.
Cornell, oh, there you go.
I put in there Cornell Labs Big Day 2019. That's actually on May 4th this year, and that is all citizen science. Are you familiar with that, Daryl?
I was referring to the Christmas bird counts, but it's pretty much the same thing as where they ask people to sign up for these counts, and they give them locations to go. And if you are a good birder, you can help collect data on lots and lots of different bird species.
Yeah, with birds, if you really like the birds and you want to participate, there's something called eBird. It's through Cornell Labs, and you can actually go onto it, become a member of it. You can log any birds that you see, even with pictures, and experts will help you identify them if you don't know, or you can see what other people are seeing in your areas. But they encourage you, and I'm going to try to show this. You can see that. It's called the Global Big Day from Cornell Labs. It's May 4th this year. And they're encouraging people to go out, observe birds, and report what they see. And this is a huge database, a huge index that's primarily citizen science. It's backyard bird watchers.
I will tell you, if any of you like birds, Google, look up, it's called eBird, because here I am, a wildlife biologist. Someone will ask me, oh, do you have this kind of species of bird on your forest? And I'm not a big birder. I don't know. I go to eBird, and what Robert said, it's this huge database. It's amazing. It's the coolest thing in the world. You can type in any species of bird, and it has all this GIS data, which is the Global Information System, to show you where all these bird observations are. And you can look in any state, in any city, in any country in the world, and it'll show you where these observations of these birds are, any species. It's amazing. Now, having said that, every entry that goes in there is going to be tagged with who is providing that information. And so as a wildlife biologist, when say there's an endangered bird that I'm looking for on our forest, I could go to eBird and see where it was observed on our forest, and I could click on that individual entry, and it'll tell me who entered that data. And that's really important, because if we know that the person that entered the data is a really strong and knowledgeable birder, we can say, hey, it's solid information here. We know who cited this bird, and so this is valid information. If there's information in there from someone who we might not know their qualifications, we might not accept that data. but it's the most amazing resource. And I will tell you, I'm glad you brought up eBird, Robert, because there's this other website similar to eBird that's growing in popularity called iNaturalist.
Right.
And this coming Tuesday, I'm actually participating in a webinar to see if we're interested in really increasing the number of wildlife observations. What iNaturalist is, instead of being dedicated to birds, it's dedicated to everything. So you can take a picture of a plant, you can take a picture of a bird, a bobcat, a fish, and you can log it into this database called iNaturalist, and you can see where all these observations take place. Now, understand that there's a lot of things that get put up there that we don't know. I'm asked to be like someone that verifies the information. So if someone says, "Oh, here's a bobcat," I could look at a picture they took to verify that as a bobcat. And so it's a pretty intensive thing. I truly believe this is literally the direction that we're going with a lot of agencies. We're going to depend on more and more of the general public to supply us with information, because the number of biologists out there is tiny compared to the number of people on the force. And if they can take a picture or record a sound or something and log it in there, it could help us in the future to literally gather data without leaving our desk. And so it's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, Trish asked if you could include those two links in the follow-up email. She doesn't have anything handy to jot this in.
I absolutely will. I think that's a great thing. You guys will get lost, especially if you love birds. That eBird, looking up some of the species records, it's amazing because you'll see all over the globe where these birds are located.
We used it when we were in
Okay.
Scotland to find birding hotspots.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, bald eagles. Very popular species, very well known. They were very endangered at one point throughout the 50s and 60s with the use of DDT. Their populations dropped tremendously all the way up into the 70s, and they were listed as an endangered species. And so there was really concerted effort from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to document bald eagles. And we still do it. We literally log and record all known eagle nests. Now, a lot of this information is sensitive information because we don't want to, especially if it's a really endangered species, we don't want to divulge that information to the general public, because then what happens? Everyone wants to go see it. And I couldn't help but laugh because one of the funniest things I've ever encountered in my career was an eagle nest. I think it was in the Pigeon Forge area, it was a really touristy area in Tennessee, and an eagle started constructing a nest there, and someone had the audacity to put up a large construction, one of those digital construction signs that said, "Do not stop at the eagle nest," which was the most counterintuitive thing I've ever heard. So anyway, eagles, for example, highly researched bird. They knew pretty much where most eagle nests were. The great thing with eagles is they have rebounded tremendously. And we're literally getting to the point where we're not even documenting where these individual eagle nests are anymore. Anything you need to add about eagles?
No, I will say eagles are one of those few species that were never reported as a total population. They were always reported as a number of nesting pairs. So
Yes.
they counted the nests.
And I love your quote about the whooping crane. For those that don't know, the population of whooping cranes in the Eastern Flyway is just over 100, like 106 or 100, 101.
Yep.
Yeah, and they know exactly. They're like, there's 6 birds in Tennessee, there's 2 birds in Kentucky. It's amazing how detailed they get.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be that way when those birds are that few and far between. All right, this is a bird. For anyone that follows me on Facebook, I'm actually doing studies on this. This is a spotted owl, Mexican spotted owl to be exact. We go in, whenever an animal is listed as threatened or endangered, the Fish and Wildlife Service wants us to keep really good records of it. And so that's part of what we do as a wildlife biologist. We have to do these surveys to document whether or not these birds or whatever animal we're concerned about is breeding and reproducing in an area. And so this is one of the great things about a wildlife biologist. You get paid to go on hikes, to do crazy owl calls, to listen to birds, and see some of the most beautiful country in the world. So yeah, we keep track, very detailed records of individual animals and reproductive success of these animals. Okay, y'all know that is not a cougar. That is a bobcat. Now, if you're wanting to know how many bobcats are out there's so many animals. It's literally impossible to know. Um, how they're very elusive, very secretive. This is an animal that we use an index for or an indice for. For example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service requires that any bobcat that gets killed or harvested for the fur, they've got it's called the CITES program, where you've got to document each and every animal. And so you can keep track of how many of these animals are taken year to year, and we can know whether or not their population is going up or down. Another big animal that's pretty much in the news quite a bit nowadays are coyotes. Without even taking a measurement in the field, what do you think is happening with coyote populations across North America? Someone type something. They going up or down? Yes. You see, a lot of this, it's common sense. You're seeing more coyotes. They're showing up in places they've never been before. And many of you participated in my Wile E. Coyote webinar a month or two ago. They're showing up. Their populations have expanded tremendously. For the most part, hundreds of years ago, they were a Midwestern and a Southwestern species. But because we got rid of cougars and wolves and some of these other apex predators, there's a niche. There's an ecological role for them to fill. And so they've been expanding their ranges. And so without even taking a measurement, we know coyote populations are doing really, really well. So we don't have to know how many there are. We just know that their populations are growing. All right, Robert, you want to talk about frogs and how we how we counted frogs?
Okay. Um, with frogs, this is one of those things that we do it at a certain time of the year. We do it in the spring or during their breeding season, and we can uh, get an index measurement for them by listening for their calls. I make all my students learn all the frog calls in Tennessee and learn by sight and sound. That is not a Tennessee frog. Um, but identify them by sound. So we go out and we have something called the TAMP program, Tennessee Amphibian Monitoring Program, and you have a route that you drive and you stop at certain spots and you listen for a certain number of minutes and you identify what species are there and try to identify how many species are there along with the weather conditions so that we get an index from year to year to year, or certain species of frogs populations increasing, staying the same, or decreasing. But we do it by call.
The thing that I love about I'm tone deaf and colorblind. That's why I never became a birder. But I will tell you, frogs are easy. Frogs have very, very distinctive calls. For them, not everyone, but for the most part, frogs are really easy to identify by species because they're so distinctive. What about turtles? What can we do? How do we gauge turtles? I've never worked with turtles. You ever do anything with turtles, Robert?
No, but there's a project going on close to us down there in Chattanooga where they're doing box turtles. And they actually use beagles. They use beagles to locate the turtles because they're very cryptic. They blend in very well. So for these terrestrial turtles, they use beagles to find them, and then they can mark them and turn them loose. And we use mark recapture on them. Mark recapture is collecting a certain number of individuals. You mark them in a way that you assume is going to be unique, and you can find it again. You turn them back in the wild. You go back a period of time later, and you capture as many animals as you can. And the proportion of marked individuals to unmarked individuals will tell you the population. I'm sorry, Laurie. Beagles, the dogs. Yeah, that's my southern accent. Beagle.
They step them out.
Yeah, but the mark recapture method, and there's several models there. The Lincoln Peterson, the Schnabel, the modified Schnabel, modified Peterson, all these different mathematical models. But it's essentially how many marked individuals are out there, how many marked individuals are in the sample you took the second time you went out there. It's a ratio. We do the same thing
All
with
right, Robert. I was pulling the pictures from our great wildlife photographer Bob Howdeshell. What kind of turtle is that?
oh my goodness. I can't see the shell back well enough. I don't know.
And I can't promise it was taken in your area, but this is one of Bob. All of these photos are from Bob Howdeshell, who's just an amazing wildlife photographer. He lets us use all these photos.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, what is next? Okay,
I do know that one.
all right, what is that?
That's an Ocoee salamander. That's from our study site. Um, so we are doing a study.
That,
What's that?
I was just going to say that picture, just so people know, that was collected on our swap trip from last year with New Mexico students.
Yes, the bug lady. Yes, Jenny took that one. But anyway, we're doing fish and salamander, and we're doing a passage study to see if they cross these new culverts. And in that, we're doing mark recapture. So we'll actually take these salamanders and the fish, and we give them a little elastomer tattoo. An elastomer is like a plastic that never solidifies. And we inject it just under their skin, and we turn them back into the environment. And then we go back every 6 months and we sample again. If there's any unmarked animals, we mark them. If they are marked, we document where we got them, see if they've crossed. Now there are statistical methods you could use that for population estimation. Unfortunately, we'll never mark enough salamanders to get a statistically valid population estimate, because when you're thinking about salamanders, 90% of the population at any one point is below ground. So we're only sampling from 10% that we can get to. I'll never mark enough of them to get a population estimate for it, but we mark them for the movement portions. And this is an Ocoee salamander. You can tell from the little stripe on her side of her cheek right here. And these two rows of these are mottled, but these dots that have run together along her back. And she's brooding her eggs. And this is in our study site in Sinai Branch in Cherokee National Forest. And we didn't disturb her to see if she had been marked or not. We just covered her back up and let her go.
All right. And last but not least, again, I'm gonna lean on Robert because he's been involved with more fisheries studies than I have. So how do fisheries biologists estimate whether or not their populations are doing okay?
Okay. For the most part, we'll sample an area. And when I say sample, we'll block an area of a lake or a pond or what have you off. And we kill everything out of it in that spot, in that maybe 1/100th or 1/1000th of the area. And then, so we see what's there, and then we extrapolate that to the rest of the lake. That's one way to do it. Another way is, again, the mark recapture. There's a lot of tags we can put in fish. But the problem with fish is, again, it's very hard to sample enough to get enough marks on them for that to be reliable. So we oftentimes rely on what are called creel surveys, where we'll go ask fishermen, what have you caught? How many hours have you fished? And all this information, measure the fish they have. But a really interesting thing they do in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest, is they actually mark salmon fry, young salmon, as they leave to go to the ocean. They put a chip in them, just like you would put in your pet at the vet. And then that salmon goes to the ocean, grows up, and when it comes back to its stream to reproduce, they have a counter over the stream, the electronic devices over the stream that will count every one of those fish coming through. And so they're getting that mark, they're getting the recapture with a computer from the mark that they did many years before.
That goes to show how this science is constantly advancing. I had to do a field study up in Pacific Northwest, the Columbia River, which is it's just an amazing sight to see. And that Columbia River is the river system that feeds so many of the rivers in that northwestern, even the western part of the country. And that is where all those salmon, the Chinook, all these different species of salmon that you're so used to seeing these animals streaming up or swimming upstream. they go through there, and the thing with the Columbia River, and this is how a lot of environmental regulations came into play, is back in the early mid 1900s, we were always looking to develop new sources of power. So what did we start doing? We started damming rivers for this free hydroelectric power, not realizing the ramifications it had on so many of these fish species. And one of the cool things that they've done, and things are still advancing, hindsight is 2020. We didn't realize how bad these dams were for lots of species. Sometimes they did, and they did it anyway. But one of the things that was really cool with one of the dams that I visited, they literally construct runways. They have the big dam blocking the water, but they construct these separate runways where the fish are able to swim through. And they've devised these tunnel passages like within the dam, and they put in these elaborate window systems. So the fish, all these giant salmon and every species of fish that you can think of, swim past this window. And there were people out there for numbers of years that would literally have a counter and literally count the individual fish that were swimming up this chute, because that's the only way they can get past this giant dam. And they would have counters in there. You'd go in there and it'd say Chinook 723,421, and it was amazing. A lot of it's becoming more computerized, which is great. We're getting better, more accurate numbers, but there's just so many ways. And this is the last slide I have. I was going to end on the fish. There's so many different ways to count animals, count wildlife, and we take advantage of them all. And that science is constantly developing and improving. So, with that, you guys have any questions? Let's get any questions out there. I want to see what else I have. This is my summary slide. So literally summary, when we're talking about wildlife, populations count. Huh, a little play on words there. But I love that picture. How many birds do you think are in that picture there? It's pretty awesome to think about it. And yes, it was a brook trout. So before we go into the final question and answer period, I got to thank Bob Howdeshell, Robert, and Jenny. Jenny, that's the bug lady that took a lot of the pictures. I do want everyone to know, mark your calendars if you're not signed up. I think most of you are signed up. My next webinar is going to be in 2 weeks. It's Springtime Bounty. It's literally about this birthing season. The spring is when most animals are given birth. We're going to talk about that whole process and what's happening in the springtime. That's really important. Then the next one is a really good one. I hope Robert's going to help me with this one. But it's wild invaders. It's dealing with these non-native wildlife. They can be extremely, extremely destructive. So we'll talk about the different wild invaders that we have. These species that weren't originally here but are here now.
We'll talk about
that'll be
didn't know about.
Pardon?
I said we'll talk about some they probably didn't know were invaders, that they thought were native.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. And then there's one I don't know if y'all will like. Some folks will like, but it's the dark side of wildlife. And there's situations. Everyone on here loves wildlife, but every once in a while you can get into bad situations with wildlife if you're not careful. And so we're gonna explore. And don't worry, it's not getting gory, detailed type of stuff, but it'll deal about situations that you got to be mindful of. And it's not always about bears and cougars. There's been situations where people have been injured with mountain goats or coyotes or raccoons because they didn't know how to behave around them. And so that's going to be the emphasis. I'll probably change the picture so it's not dealing with bears all the time. But there are some situations you got to be mindful of. And with that, y'all know where to find us. I won't even stop. By all means, please keep leaving us comments on the Facebook page. Whether or not you like these things, it's great to get new comments every once in a while. But you guys are awesome. You're my crew that are here each and every talk, and I can't thank you enough for that. So I think that was the last one.
I think I got them so far.
Well, there's a couple of people typing away right now.
Jenny said she wanted royalties on that picture.
Oh, she wants royalties?
Yeah. I said,
Yeah.
consider that plane ride to New Mexico your royalty.
Yes. And I think many of the folks on this webinar will be interested to hear. Many of those, other than this photo, almost every photo we use of bears or whatever wildlife we're talking about, Bob Howdeshell, he's a wildlife photographer in Maryville, Tennessee. Um, Amazing wildlife photographer. He is actually going to accompany us on this upcoming swap event in July. He's buying his own ticket flying out here because he would love to document what we're doing with these students, and I think it'll be wonderful to get some professional photographs. Not that Jenny had just so you know, let Jenny know she had a much better camera than I had. The first year I had my cell phone, and that was every picture I published was from my cell phone.
Well, that camera is, I purchased it for our wildlife society because I got tired of just having cell phone pictures.
The good thing is cell phone pictures. The cell phones are getting pretty amazing quality compared to cameras of 20 years ago or 10 years ago.
Mhm.
But those new DSLRs, oh my gosh, amazing what they could do.
Well, go grumble about your hockey team loss, Trish. From what I understand, the
Okay.
Predators are still in it. So
Oh, Ginny, I apologize. I was thinking you were. We've got a couple of different Ginnies, and I was thinking you were the other one. Just so you know, Robert, Ginny Hutchison. She's a follower out in Estes Park, Colorado, and she has a comment. I'd like to comment on our elk exclosures in Rocky Mountain National Park. There is an extreme difference. We have been overpopulated by elk. Don't know the latest on them, but all you have to do is look beyond the fences. That for those that don't know what Ginny is talking about, it's a trick or a tool that biologists use. They're called exclusion cages. And so what we'll do is if there's a field or some type of habitat that we want to gauge how much browsing pressure that the deer or the elk are providing, we will literally fence off a small area where the deer and the elk can't get to it. And we let that go for 6 months, a year, and then we literally compare what does the vegetation look like inside that enclosure versus outside. And you would be blown away at how much vegetation these ungulates, these larger animals eat, because it will look like a manicured lawn on the outside, and on the inside you have this lush vegetation with all different plants and forbs and grasses. And that goes to show, like with this reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, I'm not even going to get into that debate, but it goes to show that deer and these herbivores can cause much greater harm to an ecosystem by destroying the habitat. Now, obviously, they're part of that, but when you have too many and they eat more than their share, more than they naturally, you lose lots of plant life. You lose the diversity. Not only do you lose the amount of vegetation out there, but the diversity. Different plants will disappear. And so, what does that affect? It affects little tiny ground nesting birds and salamanders and frogs. All these other animals that depend on this other vegetation will suddenly disappear when you have too much browsing pressure from one large herbivore. And that's why we're saying this. It's more detrimental to have too many deer on a landscape than it might be to have too many coyotes or wolves or other predators. And so, great point, Jenny. I'm glad you brought that up.
yeah, and Bet, what you're alluding to is what we often call animal use days. Um, the land can only support so many animals for so many days, and when you excluded the cattle, then you got growing back what they were using, and it's that way with any species of wildlife.
Hey, Robert, what was your experience looking at a lot of the public lands that are grazed out west.
I think the comment I made was, they look like they'd been pillaged. I may have used a stronger word than that, uh, because the land in New Mexico just will not support the number of head that they have on them. Unlike here, we can
Right.
grow, one head of cattle per acre. You could never do that out there, but they have too many cattle on it. They've just overgrazed it.
Yeah, and it's a big issue for wildlife. It can be damaging to the ecosystem.
Mhm.
So, guys, you were fantastic. Excellent questions and comments. I appreciate you hanging it. Again, these webinars go by way too fast because I could talk all night. And I'm looking now, and we're past Robert's bedtime. That's how long we've
Yes,
been at it.
we are. But I'm off tomorrow.
So, Robert, oh, good. I appreciate everyone joining in. Thank you so very much. I'll send a copy of the recording. I'll also include the links to the eBird and iNaturalist. Really cool stuff. But anytime you have any questions about animal populations, pop them on Facebook or shoot us an email, and we might put it on Facebook. Really good stuff, and you guys are great.
Yep. Thank you. And next time you tune in on the Wild Invaders, I'll be tuned in from the beach, so I'll have a nice background rather than just my ugly old wall behind me. So.
Well.